Right, well, the time has now turned 7 o'clock. Good evening and welcome to today's webinar, Stuck in the Mud, Improving Winter Field Management. So my name is Sarah Wynne and I'm the Managing Director of ADAS Equine. I've got over 40 years experience working with horses and have managed land for horses for over 20 years. Within ADAS, I've spent the last 20 years looking at sustainable land management practices within agriculture. So ADAS Equine really looks to fuse my agricultural knowledge with equine knowledge to support equine land managers managing their land better for the welfare of their horse and also for the benefit of the environment. And I'm joined today by Zoe Morgan, who will introduce herself.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I am a senior land management consultant at ADAS Equine. So my role is quite a practical one. I spend quite a bit of time getting out and about, visiting people at their yards, in their fields, and trying to help give them some practical ideas to get the best out of their land and their grazing. So when I'm at work, I specialise in grassland health and in soil management. But just like Sarah, I'm a horse owner myself. I've been involved with horses for many, many years, and it's about trying to bring those two areas of expertise together to try and benefit the equine community.
So before we go any further, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So all of your microphones are muted and your cameras are switched off just to reduce disturbance during the webinar. So please do leave them that way. The plan is that we'll have about a 40-50 minute conversation between Zoe and I about winter land management, and then we'll follow that with a Q&A session. I know a number of you have sent questions in advance, and we will try and pick up a few of those, and then if there's time we will also address questions from the chat. So please do, as we're speaking, write your questions into the chat function on Teams, and Lucy, who's sitting in the background, will pick those up and ask those as we get towards the end. This session is being recorded and will be available from the ADAS YouTube site after the event, and we will send out a link to that on the email that you gave us when you applied. So without further ado, let us think about what it is we're going to talk about in our webinar today. So we're going to look at 5 key areas really. We want to understand, what does a horse need from the winter pasture? What does a good winter pasture look like? How can we protect vulnerable areas? How we can adapt to changing weather conditions, and also how we can build a long-term plan for resilience. So with no further ado, let us start by thinking about what our horses need from pasture over winter. Many of you will have heard of the 5 domains of equine welfare as shown to us in this World Horse Welfare graphic, and winter turnout and pasture is an important aspect of achieving these. So Zoe, do you want to just think about what we need from pasture and explain what we're trying to achieve?
Yes, thanks, Sarah. So what I really wanted to demonstrate with this slide is that when we're thinking about what we need to be providing through our pasture for our horses, what we actually need to think about is what we are trying to achieve by having our horses, giving them turnout. So when we're thinking about the well-being of our horses, we've got the model, as World Horse Welfare provide, of the sort of 5 domains of what our horses need to be well and happy, both from a sort of physical point of view, but also sort of the nutrition, their environment and their behaviour, to have them sort of be happy and healthy with being a really good mental state as well. And when we're thinking about turnout, that is something that we very much do for the well-being of our horses. I think it's being increasingly shown that we really need to be trying to maximise turnout for our horses at all times of the year. But obviously with the rather wet conditions that we have in this country and some of the challenging soil conditions that we tend to see, trying to make sure we balance that need for, I'm sure all of us would love if we could have our horses out 24/7, but realistically in this country that isn't always possible, or quite frequently isn't possible. We need to think how we can best manage our turnout to try and provide the closest we can to what's going to give them the best possible welfare. So when we're thinking at any time of year about what we need to get out of our pasture, one of the first things you might think about is forage. So they're going to be able to be getting some nutrition out of that grass. And then they're also going to be obviously using that turnout time to move around, to get some enrichment, to give them a more interesting life. it's relaxing for them and to have contact with their fronts. So those are the kind of areas. In winter, the nutritional aspect of what you're getting out of the grassland is much reduced over what it is in summer. So in summer, they're getting a very significant proportion of their diet from that pasture that they're, eating the grass when they're out at pasture. In winter, the balance shifts away from that, and it's more the sort of four underneath. It's very much about, we want our horses to go outside so that they're not stood in a box all the time. That's really the main aim. We would expect to be giving some kind of supplementary feed, some additional forage, to meet their nutritional needs. The other aspect that you really need to think about more, particularly in winter, is the two at the bottom, about providing safe footing and providing shelter. So we've all seen it. You end up with situations in winter, if you're not careful, where you have very deep mud, horses sort of up to their knees. It's slippy, it's potentially quite dangerous, especially when you're sort of bringing horses in and out. And you can get sort of problems like mud fever as well. So it's quite challenging to provide on a winter paddock turnout that is not actually creating, in some ways, its own risks and its own can be a little bit dangerous at times. And we also need to think about, because obviously they're going to be potentially out in some adverse weather conditions, we need to make sure that there is going to be adequate shelter there, whether that be man-made shelters, whether that be hedges and trees, and whether that be, we need to, if we know we have an exposed site, knowing we need to think about potentially bringing them in bad weather, and thinking about rugging. So those are kind of the aims, and definitely very much with winter, the aims are slightly different than what you're thinking about in summer. And a lot of the time it can be it's about compromises, because managing, especially if you're on a very heavy clay soil, as we've had a few questions before the event, how do you manage clay soils? It can be very tricky to get all of those things out of your pasture. So that's the kind of framework I want to give to this webinar, is that first having in our head what we're going to try and achieve, and then we can start looking at how practically we might go about it. So Sarah, maybe you could comment a little bit more on what this sort of vision, what this idea might look like in practice.
Yeah, so what does a good winter field look like? Well, there can be many different definitions of what a good winter pasture looks like. And what's possible will very much be determined by what you've got, what your soil type is, what your topography is, what your climate is. So we're going to talk about some general principles, and hopefully you can apply those to the situations that you are in. So that good winter pasture needs to be able to deliver those needs that have been discussed by Zoe. And the best way that we can do this is by having a healthy, dense grass sward that is protecting the soil that the pasture is based on. The better the grass cover is as we go into winter, the stronger the root system, the deeper and the more widespread that root system is, and therefore the better it is able to support the activities of the horses over the winter period. And you can see two examples here of pasture. The one on the left is a piece of pasture that is being grazed in the winter. You can see it's a coarse tussocky grass. It's been left for a long period of time. That's got a really good, strong root structure, which means it will be able to hold the horses for a longer period over the winter without getting muddy. And on the right, I mean, it's a photo that was actually taken in the summer, but you can see the grass being grazed at the back and then left long at the front. And that long grass at the front will then be grazed through the winter period, and it's got that good, strong root structure underneath it to support.
Yeah, so that's great. So obviously we're trying to achieve that idea of the long grass being available over winter. That's actually been quite tricky this year with the summer that we have had that was very dry. But Sarah, perhaps if you could explain some of the actions you might take to try and achieve that grass cover that people will be looking for.
Yeah, so when we're thinking about how to get that long grass, really we need to start thinking well in advance. So I'll already be planning my next year's winter grazing now. I'll be thinking about which bits of land do I want to use next year for my winter grazing, which bits am I going to use in the summer, and how am I going to graze them. And if you've got a limited area of land, or you're on rented land or livery, it can be challenging, but you still need to be trying to think as far in advance as possible about what you're going to do for winter. Now, an awful lot of yards will tend to graze the largest area of their land through the summer. So they'll have the horses out on the biggest fields through the summer, and they'll save only a relatively small area of land for the winter. So this means that at the time of year when you've got limited grass growth, poor soil conditions, you're condensing an awful lot of the activity onto a very small area. So when I try and manage clay land, I tend to try and graze only a quarter to a third of the land area during the summer, and then conserve the rest of that land area for the winter. Now, it might be that I'll get an early graze off some of the winter pastures in the spring, and then I'll shut them off in the midsummer to make sure that they're recovered for the winter. But really, I'm trying to make sure that I've got as much of my land available for winter with a good covering of grass on it. And I want that grass to have a decent length to it, because basically the taller the grass is above the surface, the more roots it will have below the surface to help hold the horse's weight. So I've got a couple of examples here of how I might go about doing that. So I've got a rectangular field here. The stables are where the grey piece is. Say it's a 4-acre field, I'm going to graze about 1 acre of that through the summer. Now I might rotate across that, I might strip graze across that, however I'm managing my summer grazing. But what I'm trying to do is conserve the area of grass closest to the yard for the winter. And then through that winter period, I might rotate across that. So I might split that into multiple paddocks and move them across those paddocks so no one paddock gets overgrazed. I might try and strip graze it. There's various different ways that you can manage that conserved grass. So you're trying to avoid having horses standing in the same place day after day after day. I also tend to try and think about where gateways are. I actually try and avoid having too many fences on my land so that I can move electric fence around and change where gates are, change where fence lines are, to avoid getting bare patches. So another way of achieving this is through using something like a track system. So the example on the right shows you a grass track system. So you graze the perimeter in the summer. So you've got the distance that the horses are moving still is achieved, but you're conserving the middle area through the summer. And notice in both these images, I've got conserved grass right up to the yard, because what you want to do is any walkways that are not surfaced, you want to have good grass cover on them so they can support your horses for as long as possible. So I recognise not everybody is in the position where you started planning now for next year. And you've probably got to a position where already your fields are getting a bit muddy and you're struggling a bit. So what we now want to do is to look at some of the things that we can do to try and mitigate the damage to fields that are already slightly subpar. So Zoe, do you want to just take us through some ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really worth pointing out that a lot of people, that nice idea that you have of having conserved the grass, it does become a little bit tricky. The summer that we had where a lot of us were running out of grazing coming in towards the autumn has put us in a bit of a difficult position. So it wouldn't be completely out of the ordinary with the summer that we've had and then having the sort of rainfall that we've had over the last few weeks if you had ended up looking something like this around one of your gateways, in particular these areas where we tend to get the sort of localized damage. This was actually taken a couple of years ago, but it's something that I'm seeing happening, this year already. We're starting to get a bit into difficulties. So this field here, or any field where you have an area that's starting to get damaged, there are steps you can take once you start to see the damage. It's really about thinking, okay, why is the damage occurring where it is? So obviously, when you've got gateways, you've got that movement of footfall coming through. That is always going to increase the risk of damage. But also part of, I know in this example, you've got the area of damage is spreading quite away from the gateway. This is really common that what you see is actually when you have horses out on very limited forage, maybe we run out a little bit of the forage in the field, what you will see is that because the horses are congregating around the gate ready to come in wanting to have something to eat, that's when you start to see that real churn. And that's when you ought to also start to see these quite sort of dangerous conditions in terms of the footing, because they're all congregating around that gate. You get bickering and it's quite challenging. So one of the things I would recommend when you very first are starting to see damage, you're very first starting to see horses congregating around the gateway, is are there opportunities for you to be able to actually feed some additional forage, supplementary forage, some hay or haylage out in the field. Now, the way you do this, you have to be very careful. Otherwise, what you end up doing is you just move all the damage away from the gate and you end up moving it to around wherever you're feeding your hay. If you have somewhere like in the examples that Sarah showed, where you have a sort of a yard patch somewhere with some hard standing where you can pop the feed out, that would be fantastic. If you were going to go for that sort of like hay box option on the left, ideally you would have some kind of surface around that. Otherwise you're just going to end up with a complete muddy mess around that. But there are options. You know, can you put hay in any field shelters you might have, sort of hay nets tied up along fence posts, or also just sort of piles out in the field. In some ways, the sort of piles out in the field option, you can obviously put them in different places every time. So in some ways, that's the best option in terms of the soil. All of these options obviously is a little bit dependent on your herd dynamics. If you have 1 or 2 horses, or you know, a couple of horses that you know get along well, this can be okay. In larger herd dynamics, there is a bit of a risk of putting the hay out in the fields, and then you would probably want to be thinking about, you know, can you supplement them in their stables so that again they're not getting quite so hungry when they're around the gate. So this is sort of an avoidance strategy, and there are a few people this year who we actually recommended to start putting the hay out really quite early because the grass had got so short over the summer. So that's a sort of bit of thinking ahead, but also as you start to see the damage occurring, popping hay out is something that you can do to sort of try and alleviate that. And what you actually end up doing is, you feel like, oh, I'm worried I'm going to be starting to use my winter supply of hay, but actually by limiting the damage, it means that you're more likely to get more out of the grass as you're going on throughout the year. So that's just something there to think about. In terms of other things you can do around that damage, if we just flick back to that image, as I said, one of the problems in this particular gateway is that the horses tend to congregate right around the gate waiting to come in. So perhaps you could, and we've got the sort of yellow line shown in there, imagine if you were to put a piece of electric diagonally across the gate, that would help to back the horses off. It does make it a bit safer bringing in and out because you've not got that real funneling into a corner, but also it sort of helps to spread the area so that they're not sort of shoved into one little place and moving along there. The other thing to point, actually, I've just been mentioning about forage. This field does look in a bit better state this year because actually we did go out and start feeding forage a bit earlier on, so it hasn't got into the same state this year, which is nice to see. The other thing you can think about, you've got in that image, you can see the little 2 blue barrels. That's the water supply for this field, thinking about whether you could move them. I mean, obviously these are already a little bit away from the gate. You can imagine if these were also around the gate, it could be a little bit tricky. And the other one, actually, if you were looking at this setup, finding they're congregating in the corner, I think people tend to think of fences and gateways as being kind of fixed. But actually, if you wanted to, and you found you were getting a consistent problem around that gateway, you could move the gateway more to sort of to where the waters are and have the waters somewhere else, because you wouldn't then have that funneling effect into the corner. Now that comes into more the sort of long-term planning, but in terms of this year, if you're starting to be problems, it's a point of making sure you're taking notice of what's happening, remembering and thinking, what can I do for next year, rather than just every year going, oh, I've got a bog again. How did that happen? Another thing you can potentially do is think about that really high traffic area. Perhaps you could put some surface down. Now there are long-term solutions, like, you know, if you could put hardcore sort of gravel down. I've seen people have success with wood chip, ideally with a membrane, but people, you know, popping wood chip down as a temporary measure on certain soils. The other one I've seen used quite successfully actually is just roll like a bale of straw out over it, just when you've got that sort of immediate, you know, that moment when you go, oh, I'm really struggling to get in and out of here. Have you got either some old waste hay or some straw that you can kind of pop down in that area, just to give you a bit of a mat as a temporary solution, rather than wading through acres and acres of bog. The other aspect in this particular field, on the right hand side where we've got the hedge line, there is actually a ditch in there, which means that tends to be the side of the field where the water lies. So potentially that would be another sort of indicator. Maybe if we could move the gateway to somewhere else in this field, maybe it wouldn't get so wet. So it's very much thinking about not being fixed in how you manage your land, thinking, okay, I always get this problem here. I think there can be a bit of a mindset that field always gets boggy, that's how it is, and actually going, right, okay, I've got a problem, what little things can I implement that might just make it that little bit easier and that little bit tidier. So Sarah's got a really nice example of that, where there was a yard that had some sort of problems with standing water, and what they did as sort of a short-term fix, and then what they were able to put in longer term to try and manage that from a more long-term perspective.
Okay, so yeah, so this is an example of a land that's on ridge and furrow. You can see in the first image there that there's water is forming effectively canals up the field, and these repeat along the field. And then you've got the dry areas at the top of the ridge. So you've got the furrow sits wet, the ridge sits slightly drier. But this water is coming right up to the land, right up to the stables in this picture. So in the bottom right hand corner of the picture, there is the edge of the concrete yard. It's only a very small yard, so the edge of the concrete yard, and then goes into the water. And you can see the yard owner has tried to start with to put a bit of carpet down to try and modify that problem. Probably that happened before all the water was there and it was just a bit muddy. Now that carpet doesn't stand a chance because it's just so wet. So the first thing that they did after the carpet was to try and put down some ground stabilization grids. So these are fairly old photos. I think they're from about 2012. So these were grids that were available on the market at the time, and they were put down in the middle of winter. As you can see, it's snowing, the flooding is still there. But what the ground control grids did was it created a surface that the horses were able to effectively float on and have a bit of outdoor time. You can see the bits of electric fence here. This yard is effectively subdivided into small turnout spaces that allow the horses to come out of their stables onto these grids and onto the yard. They did put some rubber mats on top of those grids to make them less slippery. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it prevented the horses from creating an absolute mud pit in that corner piece of the yard, and also meant that the horses could get out when the fields were actually inaccessible, because you can see how much flooding there is on that land. So the following summer, having identified that, well, the grids did something to improve, but they weren't really enough, the landowner then decided to put in a more permanent solution. So you can see how much water stands there in the winter. So they used a combination of limestone over a ground membrane, and then the ground stabilization grids, and another layer of limestone was actually put through those grids once they were down to then stabilize the whole lot. So to create a permanent hard standing area that allowed the horses to be able to utilize an outdoor space when the fields were flooded. Unfortunately, with ridge and furrow, there's a limit to what can be done, but they did put drainage in, and actually pumping using a dirty water pump to get rid of the water from the channels into a ditch also helped to dry the land out better. But the end solution, and unfortunately the end solution image here is not as wet as the previous one, but basically it enabled the horses to continue to be turned out the following winter and have access to outdoor space. I think they even used it overnight rather than having to shut them in the stables. So the welfare aspect for the horses was much improved. So it's a really nice example of just making simple changes. It wasn't an expensive activity to do because it's only a relatively small area that was hardcored, but the welfare benefits from just doing that small area were significant. Now, it is a permanent surface that's been put down, so it is important to make sure that you consider things like planning permission when you go to do that change of surface. And talking about changes of surfaces, Zoe, do you want to talk a little bit more about how we can create some of these surfaced areas?
Yeah, so this is a really good example, obviously, of somebody popping in a purpose-built area where horses can have a little bit of turnout off the grass. I think there is increasingly being interest for a lot of yards in trying to have some kind of area where you can get turnout. that isn't having them out on your fields. I think as we seem to be seeing sort of more extreme wet, really intense wet periods, more people are going, okay, I really don't want to have days where I actually have to shut my horses in the stables because it's just, you know, the fields are completely inundated. So it's a bit of looking at an alternative area. So we have these we call these loafing areas or turnout pens, where we can do something a bit different than having them out on the park. You know, the options I think traditionally have been they're either out in the field and they're in the stable. I think loafing areas very much come into a mindset of, I would be trying to think of them as when my fields are in a real state and I can't use them without damage, thinking of loafing areas as here's somewhere my horses can get some of those benefits of turnout that I talked about at the beginning, rather than being in their stable. So it's trying to give us a bit of a halfway house, a happy medium that for some, you know, either a part of the year or very particularly wet days, it just gives you a tool to be able to manage your grazing in a way that, you know, you're not creating such damage. You have better grazing conditions most of the time, and some of the time you have this option to be somewhere else. So perhaps thinking about, you know, have you actually got somewhere on your yard or within your facilities that you actually can do that already? Because obviously, as Sarah's mentioned, when you're putting down these sort of hardcore areas, there's potentially planning considerations. You've got to think about surface drainage, things like that. But quite a lot of yards will actually potentially have somewhere, if you're a bit creative, where you could use as an alternative. So the on the left-hand side there, the two images. So there's the bottom left with the horses having a lovely time hoodling about in an arena. So that's one option if you have an arena. I know people can be a little bit particular about what they use their arena for, and in livery settings, obviously, if other people want to ride, it can be tricky. But if you've got your own yard, it's something you're happy to do. That's a space which is obviously designed for horses running around on it. So it's a good one to think, you know, for a day or two, could I pop them out in the arena just so that they can have a bit of a leg stretch and a run around without having to churn up a field if you've had like a storm event, something like that. The other options, if you've already got sort of hardcore tracks, so the top of those two, up to those two images, that is just a hardcore track leading to the fields on the yard. So originally that was just a turnout track, and that's actually, there's a section there, there's a couple more sections leading up to the fields at the back. And a couple of years ago, the yard owner had a fabulous idea. What if we sectioned that off and actually could use that as turnout pens, because there is hardcore down on all of those sections, just to give them somewhere. As I say, that tends to get used for a few weeks, sort of January time, when the fields, it's a very heavy clay in that area. So sort of January time, we make a few pens on there that gives an option to have some of the horses turned out, that otherwise there'd be some days where you're going where we really can't turn them out because it's so wet, there's flooding at the bottom of the fields, that kind of thing. Now, so that's a good starting point. Have you got somewhere? Have you got some areas of track? Have you got, for example, a little bit of yard area in front of your stables where you could maybe pop some electric vent rounds, depending what your what your situation is? Have you got somewhere, you know, a yard, a bit of where you park, wherever you park your car, if it's holding up to your car, coming and parking on it, potentially, could you pop your horses out on there? Just have a think about. And obviously, the bigger the area, the more sensible it is to use it more of the time. But in a sort of real storm heavy rainfall event, have you got somewhere else that you can use rather than having to be stabled? Then you can get a bit more inventive if you're happy to create somewhere from scratch. If you think, right, I really could benefit from somewhere with one of these turnout pens, these loafing areas, what could you do if you were doing something from scratch? So there's a couple of different surfaces you can go for. There are some quite good sort of mats that you can pop down now. Some of those are quite effective. You do have to be quite careful. They can be quite slippy, so you need to put some kind of additional surface over the top, but they are you kind of can think of as temporary because they can be lifted back up again, depending exactly how you manage them. There are options for wood chip. Wood chip generally needs a membrane if it's going to manage, otherwise it just gets kind of mulched in, but it can provide a bit of an option. And then you've got some of your more permanent solutions, your gravel, your hardcore and bits like that. I've seen people use like arena surface as well in a similar way. So we're not going to have a whole arena, but use a similar surface on like a small paddock or a small pen. Some of the more permanent solutions, you are going to want to be thinking about the drainage as well. So anybody who's built an arena will know that you have to think about having drainage, otherwise you just end up with puddles sitting on your arena or your turnout pen and it's not better, so you might need to think about drainage. But there are, you know, a range of options, from your sort of having a really custom made hardcore drained pad through to, can I use a little bit of existing track area that I've already got? So it's just definitely something to bear in mind of, can we stop thinking about the options of being they're either in the field or they're in the stable, and think about some of these intermediate options, whether they might be appropriate for you.
And I think it's really important when we're thinking about these options, you can use them to help prolong the life of your pastures. So, for example, having access onto some of these areas from the pasture for eating hay, you can see in the bottom middle image, the horses are eating hay here. They've got free access to the pasture as well, but when they're doing their loitering, they're standing on that surface rather than milling about in a gateway as well. So it can be really helpful to extend your pasture life as well. And I think,
and on the flip side of them, they're quite good in summer as well. When you've got if you have laminatics, you're trying to reduce the time at grass, they're another option there, but seems a long way away at the moment.
It does rather. And just a note on using arena surfaces. If you are using arena surface and you've got droppings that you've got to clear, you just need to make sure your surface doesn't have things in it like carpet or what have you that will contaminate your muck heap. So that's something to consider. Cleaner sand is definitely a safer option. So Zoe, do you just want to explain a little bit more about how you might think about siting these things and the sorts of exercise you might do looking at your land to plan for resilience in the future?
Yeah, so the main way I would sort of go about thinking about this, I've got a nice little example here of a nice little yard. What you want to do is think about where your higher and lower risk areas are, where are the places that most likely to get damaged. And something I do recommend you to go and do is what I've got the example of here, is think about doing yourself a little map to help you visualize it. So this little yard here, you've got sort of like a watercourse running down the left hand side, you've got a drainage ditch running through the middle. So that's sort of where our potentially standing water is. That's also where our drains can run to. So when if you're putting some drainage in for an arena or a turnout pen, if you know we've got a drainage ditch, that's somewhere you can potentially run some drains too. Now this particular yard, the field sort of above the drainage ditch, so the top half that I've got coloured in orange, these fields are possibly not as extreme as the example Sarah showed, but they are ridge and furrow. They do tend to get some areas that sit quite wet. But what sort of mark those on as orange, we know, and that's actually from experience, those fields tend to get really churned up quite easily during the winter. So they tend to get more waterlogged, more muddy. Whereas the fields to the lower end of the yard, the two lower fields, they are more sort of traditionally, they were originally sort of agricultural fields. They're under drained. They don't tend to sit as wet. And so it's thinking about, okay, we know the top fields tend to get wetter than the bottom fields. Let's use those bottom fields that are a little bit drier as a bit more of the winter turnout. So it's just thinking about your situation, what you might want to do, and you can do that as a bit of an exercise yourself for your areas. Now this is you can see on here, coming from the yard, there's a sort of zigzag of hardcore track. So this is the hardcore track that was in the photo earlier. So that is the area originally we were just using it as a track to get backwards and forwards to the fields. But that was a sort of resource available, that some bright idea of, hang on a minute, we could be using this as some existing track area. Now what we've got, because obviously there is the actual surface track, I've marked on the sort of little purple, that's where the gateways are. You can see in the two yellow fields, there's the sort of top purple blob is the one that goes onto the track. So that one we kind of can get in and out of that one okay without causing too much churn and too much damage, because we've got the hardcore track leading to there. And then the purple blob below that is access between the two fields, but there's no track there. So that bit is one of the areas on this particular yard that can get the most churned up, quite muddy, because when you've got winter turnout on there, they're coming backwards and forwards in through that gate all the time, and there isn't much choice and much option of that. Now what you might want to think about doing with those winter fields is potentially, you have that idea of Sarah saying that you want to have in your better weather, you want to be using the areas in the fields further away and sort of move back towards the yard, so that in your worst winter conditions you're traveling the least distance because you've not got that sort of churn happening. So what you might want to do is start kind of on the, if you wanted to think about sort of like a strip grazing management, you could start on the left-hand end of those two fields and slowly move yourself nearer with the strip grazing as you're going, so that when you're in that muddy, coming in worse as the weather gets worse and worse, you're moving towards the yard. Now, in this instance where you've got the one gate, obviously that becomes quite tricky because you'd be going in and out that gate all the time. One option, which again, you'd need to think about the planning permission for, would be to keep those two permanent gates and run some hardcore track, so some surface track down from one to the other. The other thing you could do if you were going to sort of strip graze it is pop some additional gates in so that you're not actually working up the going through the same area every single time. That's what sort of Sarah mentioned with the system where there's more electric fence based. You can move where the entryways are so that you're not really having a heavy impact at that one time. That's kind of the two ways of going about it. If you want to use something permanently, think about what you might be doing for a surface, and if you aren't going to go down the surfacing route, then it's sort of moving things so that you're not really hammering that one area. So this yard also has, as I said, the sort of loafing area options, and there is an arena there, which, if there was weather conditions where you thought I would just want to go and let them have a bit of a spin round, then potentially you could use that area as well. So there's a few sort of resources available there. Now, in the past, the field around the arena was used as a winter turnout field before the arena was there, because you can see it's worked out quite nice near to the yard. It was quite practical. Since the arena has gone in, the field works that were done to pop the drainage in for the arena have made it that field doesn't drain as well as it used to, and so it's something this yard has gone, okay, we tend to get a very wet situation around there now, and move to using the winter grazing on those yellow fields. So it's very much thinking about what I really want to encourage you to be is be really flexible. Don't think this is how I've always managed my fields and this bit's always muddy, that's really annoying. Think, this is how I'm managing my fields, this bit always gets really muddy, what can I do about that? Which is partly about siting and location, partly about thinking about your surfaces, thinking about turnout, think about what resources you have and what you can change and what you might be able to do differently. There is nearly always something that you could be doing better if maybe you just haven't thought of it yet. So I recommend you to do this sort of exercise, map out your land, think about what areas you've got, and try and think about, okay, next year I'm struggling here, next year what am I going to do about it?
Okay, so that kind of brings us towards the end of the discussion part of the webinar. There is a little bit of homework for you to think about, and then we'll come into the questions. So if you do have any questions, do please drop them into the chat and we will pick them up. But your homework, we want you to go away and think about the allocation of your summer and winter grazing, and think about where you might want to graze next year for next winter, trying to find the driest areas, the best drained areas, the areas that you can access most easily from the yard, and trying to make sure that you can serve those areas ready for the following winter. So get your grazing plans in place. Make a note of what has and hasn't worked this year. What were the really good bits? What bits really haven't worked? And then think about what you can do differently. Do you need to fence back from a gateway? Do you need to move a gateway? Do you need to cut a hole in a fence line to create a new gateway? And then think about mapping out your land to visualize the opportunities. Google Earth is great for getting that overview of the land. And then there's various different mapping things that you can use, or you can just mark it up using something like the markup on your phone. So and then so go away and draw some maps of your land. So I think we're just going to turn off the slideshow, and we will start answering some questions. So I'm going to start with a few questions that came in on the forms that you registered with, and there were a couple there about winter field recovery and implements. So the first question was, what tools or implements are required to fix a muddy field following a heavy autumn or winter. So I like the fact that this person's already thinking ahead about what they're going to do to recover their fields. So my starting point would be a chain harrow, or possibly a fixed tine harrow with the tine's aggressive side down on the chain harrow. Generally, chain harrows have 3 different directions you can use them: a non-aggressive side, a slightly aggressive side, and then a really aggressive side. And you want that most aggressive side there. You want to find that tiny narrow window if you're on clay where it's just dried out enough that you're not going to sink, and it's not gone like concrete, so you're just going to rattle over the top. And unfortunately with clay, that window can be very, very narrow. So you need to be ready to go when you get that weather opportunity. And then you need to just harrow it and harrow it and harrow it to break down those ruts. And I would say try and avoid rolling. So rolling is not your friend as a landowner, because what rolling does is it compacts and smears the soil so that you are reducing the pore filled airspace, you're reducing the ability of that land to absorb water, and it will just become wetter in the future. So if you can possibly avoid it, try and use a harrow, because that will reduce the compaction element and break up the surface a little bit. If you cannot get your fields level enough, a roller is a last resort, but I would try and only roll in a very, very bad situation. And then once you've done your harrowing, reseed it and leave it for the summer. Zoe, I don't know if you want to add any more to that.
Yeah, I think the other available tool, possibly people are less likely to have them themselves, but another tool that can be quite useful is some of the designated sort of specially designed aerators, grassland aerators. Yeah, as I say, people are probably less likely to have them themselves, but maybe if you know sort of local farmers or so you might be able to get a contractor with them, something like that. Some of those are essentially a roller with kind of butter knives on, basically, that do the sort of leveling operation that a roller would do, but while also introducing some cracking back into the soil. So that is another option if you can get access to one. The other thing I would say for small areas around gateways, I'm going to sound bonkers, but if you've got a really small area that's got really mushed up around a gateway and you just want to kind of correct a little bit, you can do wonders with a garden fork if you're determined. It is actually something I have seen done with success. Obviously, I'm not suggesting anybody do that over a whole field, but if you have just a little patch around a gateway that gets really mullered, it's something you could consider.
Yeah. Okay, and then the follow-up to that was, when do you start using those tools? And I think the answer is when the soil conditions are right. So you don't want to be, if your vehicle is leaving tyre marks and skidding, your field is too wet. So you want to be at the point where it's dried out enough to be able to hold your vehicle without it causing ruts, because if it's rutting, it's creating compaction, but not so dry that it doesn't have any impact. And that is
There's
a
a
narrow
test you can do for that. There is a test you can do for that before you get to the point of seeing whether your vehicle sinks. What you want to do is to sort of get some, and this is clay soils that this works for rather than lighter sands. If you get a sort of ball of soil in your hand and you roll it out as if you're trying to roll it out into a worm, if you can roll a really long worm without it breaking, then it's still too wet. What you want to be able to do is sort of almost make a bit of a worm, and then it breaks into chunks that are maybe a couple of inches long. That's your cue to go. So if it's still so wet that you can roll out this big, long, wiggly worm, don't go yet. If you get to a point where it's too hard for you to be able to roll out any worm at all, then you've missed your window. So you want to be able to roll it a little bit, and then it starts breaking, and that's your cue to go.
Okay, that's a great visual. Thank you, Zoe. So the next question from the forms was, what do we do about standing water? There's a couple of different questions on standing water, one on natural stone that's got standing water and another one on clay. So what do we do, Zoe?
When you've already in the position where the standing water is there, the best thing I can recommend you to do, if the situation allows it, is to fence them out so they can't get in it and make it worse, which obviously works fine if it's sort of a puddle at the bottom of a field. So if you've got a field maybe with a bit of a slope and the bottom end tends to get a bit flooded with some standing water, if you can fence them out of that so that they're not, you know, run a bit of electric across so that they can't actually get in it to wallow and make horrible mud baths, then that is the sort of first step. Obviously, if it's sort of in ridge and furrow, that can be quite tricky to do because you can't sort of fence them into little stripes. But that's just sort of my immediate, okay, standing water. And then the next thing to think about is, why is it there? So some of that might have to do with the drainage. So if your field, especially if you're on heavy clay, there's a strong chance that you have sort of artificial land drains underneath the field, especially if you've got ditches like in the example I showed, then there's almost certainly some land drains running into those. So you might want to think about going and, are your ditches clear enough for the water to get away? And are the if you can find the outfalls, the pipes coming from under the field drains, are they clear? Because obviously if there's nowhere for the water to go, the land drains may as well not be there because they won't be running and they won't be getting the water away. And then the other side of it is, if you've got compaction, so if the horse's feet have been squashing down that top layer of soil, the water can't get in to infiltrate into the soil and get away into the drains or whatever. Is, you know, I think there was a question where somebody said, well, we're on gravel, why are we seeing standing water? That probably means you've got compaction damage from the from previous years of grazing that would need to be corrected. And that's where the sort of purpose designed aerators I mentioned would be really useful if you can get your hands on one, to try and punch some holes in that and let the water drain away.
Yeah, and then as a kind of an emergency solution, I have used dirty water pumps to actually just remove water from standing water pools. So that is a potential option if you've either got electricity to run one or a generator to get rid of it, and that can just help to dry the field out more quickly than if you leave that standing water to just evaporate. So, okay, Lucy, can we turn to some of the questions from the chat, please?
Yeah, of course, Sarah. I'll start reading out from the top. Stephanie Wood, you said that taller grass has longer roots below the surface. What happens to the roots when the long grass is grazed down close to the soil? Do the longer roots still remain, or do they become damaged and regress to match the short grass above the soil?
So a lot of that will depend upon how long you keep the grass short. So if you graze it very quickly and then it's allowed to recover, then the roots won't degrade. But if you put your horses on there and then they graze it short and you leave it short for weeks or months on end, the grass roots will gradually degenerate because the grass does not need as much root to maintain the canopy. So it really depends how long you leave it short, really.
Perfect. Another question. I've been at my property for 2 winters now, so I'm learning how the ground and fields behave. I've got mud control mats around the gateway, a shelter that have been a lifesaver, but there are areas that do fill up with standing water. I've been given 2 different options to help with this, French drains and the other option, an ACO drains along the edge of the shelter and along the back of the outbuilding. The person who recommended ACO said French drains would be no good as the horses will eventually put their feet through. Are there any recommendations?
I mean, my other thought, if you're getting standing water around the shelter, can you put some rainwater harvesting butts in, get useful use out of the water, and they're not going onto the drain? I mean, it's thinking about where the guttering's channeling the water, assuming I've understood that correctly, that the problem is the water that would have been falling on the field is now falling on the shelter and moving. Without seeing the site, it's quite difficult to say, but you do need to, one way or another, get that water away.
Yes, I mean, a French drain is probably a shorter term solution in many respects because they will eventually churn it up, but it will work as a starting point.
Short term.
Perfect, thank you. Another question, if you have hay down and not completely eaten but just mulched into the ground, does that affect how the sward will grow in the spring?
You can get some quite nice seeding of things from hay. It depends whether if your hay is lovely from some kind of species-rich meadow, you might find some delightful flowers growing around where it was. If it's from somewhere weedy, you might end up with loads of docks around where it was. It's perfectly healthy from a soil point of view, and it'll be adding some organic matter and depends a little bit. If it's got to that thing where it goes really slimy, it's probably not ideal, and it might take a little bit to recover. When I was mentioning earlier about potentially having the hay and straw down, I think part of that is about making sure you get it down early enough that you're not trying to add it into squelch already, thinking ahead early enough that it doesn't, trying to protect it before it gets to that state.
I've used hay to kind of cover bare areas. So if you do get in a situation like the photo we had that was bare ground, a thin scattering of hay over that will protect the surface when you get into summer to keep a bit of moisture in, and will help you. It will have seed in it, and you can add a little bit more seed underneath it, and it will actually really help to regrow. And I've actually had quite good success getting regrowth on bare ground from hay. If you leave hay down where there is grass already, it will suppress the grass growth until you get the new grass coming through. So it's a bit of a balancing act. You don't want it too thick. You ideally don't want it on existing grass, but on bare ground, it can be really useful to help regenerate that, and it puts a bit of organic matter back.
Okay, further question. What implements do I need to repair an overgrazed muddy paddock after the horses have gone off it? Harrow, roller, etc. When do I start doing it?
I think we covered that one a little bit actually with the question that came ahead with the harrow. I think Sarah sort of went over that.
Try and bin the roller.
If you can. Obviously, if they're going to break their knees without one, then use the roller. But ideally, from a soil point of view, avoid it if you can.
Perfect. Are there grass species it is good to have on your winter fields?
The main thing I would say about picking your grass species is don't have just one thing. If you're sort of reseeding and you're in that position where you can choose what you're having, have a nice mix, because all the different grasses, I think people don't realize there's hundreds of different species of grasses. And if you have a variety, some of them will cope well against drought and some of them will cope well against winter conditions. Some of the ones that have a more sort of sprawling habit that make more of a mat can be quite good because they're more likely to provide that sort of protective cover. But there's so many grass options. It's probably
yes, you're probably best
about variety.
Yeah, speaking to your seed provider to see what the habits of the grasses are. You want some deep rooting ones, you want some spread rooting ones. Yeah, sometimes actually it's quite useful to have ones that aren't quite as tasty in the winter grazing. I mean, I know it sounds a little bit
some of the meadow grasses, yeah,
but some of the less tasty ones, so the horses don't nibble them quite so short, can be quite helpful. I mean, most people don't like full soak grass, but I've got quite a lot of that in my pasture, and it's great for holding it together because the horses don't like it either.
Yeah, and the other thing about speaking to your seed rep, because they hopefully know the local area, and it depends a little bit about which soil type you have, what's going to grow well. So it's very much speak to somebody local about what they would recommend on your particular soil.
Okay, third question. Rotating grazing through winter with the current wet and warm conditions, is there at any point trying to rest a winter field now which is starting to become poached with low grass cover? Reluctant to supplement hay due to weight management, or am I better off sacrificing this field for the moment?
The weight management bit is a bit of a curveball, I would say. So from a land management perspective, I would try and rotate. So on my land, I try and have 3 different fields through the winter. So I have a field they've been on now for the last 2 months. They'll come off that at the end of December. Then I'll move on to the next section, which should last them through January, February. And then my field that I've had them on in December time will have probably recovered a bit. It's not got so damaged that they can't go back on it. So by resting it, actually you can get another grazing bout off it. So I would try and rest it. The weight piece is a challenge, although interestingly we've found with one of ours who is a very good doer, he's actually done better with a muzzle and hay than he has on just grass. So I think it's a bit of trial and error with the weight piece, but getting them to just nibble down to nothing will be bad for them because there's higher sugar content in that short grass, and they're also often hungry, so they'll try and eat for longer. So it's a bit of trial and error with a weight carrier. But unfortunately, nutrition is not what we're here for.
The other thing I would say about the leaving a piece to rest, it depends what you'd have to be putting them onto in order to rest it. If it is all at a fairly similar state of on its last legs, there sometimes is an argument for leave them on one bit because then they're going to equally trash whatever you put them on. But ideally, if you can get them on, there's a few different areas, and hopefully rest each bit a little bit before they come back round. That would be the preferred option. If you really, and I think that's probably something we haven't really said actually, if you really are going to do a sort of sacrifice paddock because that's what's going to work for you, which is probably not the preferred option, think really carefully about where you put it, that it's not somewhere that's going to put a load of churned mud running straight into a stream or a ditch or something, and it's sort of your highest, driest bit of ground. If you must do it, then think really carefully about where you're going to put it, because obviously that is a solution that people do use.
Yeah.
Okay, one final.
We've only got a few minutes left, so I guess it's kind of picking and choosing the last few questions.
Yep, I'm going to give you one more question, Sarah, and then you can go into the wrap up if that's okay. Is it worth having a soil test done in the spring to help with management? If so, how does one go about this?
Yes, absolutely. Not necessarily so much the sort of poaching side, but soil sampling is really useful for deciding more generally what you want to do with sort of nutrition. There were a few questions I think that were to do more with managing species and things in the grass. It does help you to decide what is suitable for your grass and what manage you want to do. If the question is, should you soil sample, my answer is always yes. And in terms of doing that, I mean, it's a service that we offer is helping to interpret the results. We have quite a good bit of information. I don't want to go too much into it now because I'm aware we just want to cover the sort of wrapping up comments. But if you do want some more information on that, there'll be some information on the website, I think.
Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for some really great questions. We will try and go through those questions after the event and give answers to the ones that we haven't been able to address, and we'll send those out via email. We promise you we won't spam you with loads of emails, but we will just share the information from the webinar and just occasionally a few things about what we're doing. And I guess one of the things I want to share with you, if you do want more information going forwards about land management, we do have a land management academy. So this land management academy, it's 3 hours of information about sustainably managing your yard, your land, and a little bit more about soil nutrition as well. So do please go to our website. You can use that QR code to get there. You can link to the Academy from our website, but you can also find out a bit more. But I want to leave you just with a few take-home pieces. So go away, think about mapping your land. Be flexible in how you manage stuff. Just because you've always done it that way doesn't mean you always have to. So think outside the box. Can you put in a different gateway? Can you use a different field? Can you fence the horses in a different way? I mean, personally, I think electric tape is your friend as a land manager to help you to be flexible in how you do it. I realise you have to have horses who respect electric fences, but it can be a really useful tool in helping to protect vulnerable areas, to manage the flow of horses, and just think innovatively about how you do it. It doesn't have to be a square field. You can do all sorts of different things just to change things up. Think about how you might use surfaces, and if you can create some sort of loafing area, resting space that you can feed hay on, get horses out of stables, but not have them on slippy, bad ground, then do. But most importantly, start thinking now about how you can manage your grassland for next year to try and minimize the amount of damage that happens. You're always going to get some mud. We can't be perfect, but let's try and make it as little as possible. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Zoe, for some great insight.
Thank
And I
you.
hope you all enjoyed it. The recording will be sent through to you later on. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.